Hello learners, so far we have studied about the concept and purpose of environmental impact assessment. Today in this session we will learn more about the principles and practices of environmental impact assessment. We have studied so far that environmental impact assessment is one of the main legislative tools that are established to minimize an anthropogenic impact on the environment. Here we know that what is the anthropogenic activities, that is the human made activities. So environmental impact assessment that can be defined as a process by which the information about the environmental effects of a project, here the project is any activity, whether it is a construction activity, whether it is a mining activity of a project, is collected both by the developer and also from the other sources and taken into account by the relevant decision making body before a decision is given on whether the development should go ahead or not. If we will consider the evolution of environmental impact assessment in India, we have to understand that what is the role of environmental impact assessment. It was officially recognized at the Earth Summit in Rio Conference in 1992, where the Rio Declaration proclaimed that environmental impact assessment should be taken as national instrument for proposed activities that may likely to have adverse impacts on the environment. Until 1980s, most of the project activities were executed with minimum or without environmental considerations in India. In 1980 itself, the Department of Environment came to existence. That means it has been established in 1980 itself. In 1976 to 77, environmental impact analysis was started in India when the Department of Science and Technology was asked by Planning Commission to examine the river valley projects from the environmental angle. That means in India only river valley projects are considered for these environmental impacts that time. So this was subsequently extended to cover the projects which required approval of the Public Investment Board. So they may be administrative decisions and also lack the legislative support. So the Government of India enacted the Environment Protection Act on 23rd May 1986. To achieve the objectives of the Act, one of the decisions taken was to make environmental impact assessment statutory. After completion of legal procedure, a notification was released on 27th January 1994 and of course eventually amended on 4th May 1994 and 10th April 1997 and also 27th January 2000. Executing environmental impact assessment statutory for 30 activities to begin with. In 1985, the Department of Environment and Forest was upgraded to the status of the ministry. From that point of time, nowadays it is steadily the environment clearance to large projects became mandatory administrative necessity. Of course, inherently in 1990 itself, initially the Ministry of Environment and Forest notified environmental impact assessment guidelines for river valley projects to study the adverse impacts of the submergence zones of the projects on forest, wildlife, waterlogging potential and impacts on upstream and downstream aquatic ecosystems, water related pathogens and diseases, climate changes and also seismicity, like these many aspects they have considered. In 1994, the Ministry of Environment and Forest notified official environmental impact assessment process with an yardstick that is decided to take environmental clearance for projects from center or state level. In the first instance, that is to begin with, in the initial stages, projects like nuclear power plants and related activities, river valley projects and ports, harbors, airports and petroleum refineries and chemical fertilizers, pesticides and also pharmaceutical companies like bulk drugs and pharma companies, oil explorations and synthetic rubber companies asbestos, they have been identified and were submitted under central government for environmental clearance. In Environmental Impact Assessment 1994, the project proponent was required to consult the State Pollution Control Board, that is SPCB, for the approval of the identified site. If the site came under any special notification like forest land or coastal zone or ecologically sensitive area, if it is marked as such, then the clearance for the site was to be obtained from the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, which functions under the control of the central government. So, there are so many principles for the environmental impact assessment procedures. So, first we will see the principle 1, what it tells about it. So, it speaks about proactive planning and decision tool. We know that is an environmental impact assessment process is a proactive environmental planning tool. It is a management tool to avoid and predict adverse environmental impacts which are likely to be caused by the proposed development. So, an environmental impact assessment should provide a genuine information to the decision making process. If we will consider the principle number 2, that speaks about avoidance, prediction and prevention of adverse environmental consequences. That states that the target of the environmental impact assessment process, which is to avoid and stop adverse environmental consequences of the proposed projects. In case of unavoidable adverse environmental impacts, it provides reduction measures and also controlling measures. That means not only provide the permission, it also provide the guidelines and also helps the proposal to control the measures as well as the mitigation procedures. And next will comes to the principle 3. What it speaks? It speaks about making effective impact on decision making as soon as possible. That means opportunity and thinking proactively about options and alternatives. It is most important to facilitate any effort to enhance the environmental performance of the proposed development at the beginning of the project planning stage rather than at the later stage of the project development. That means after completion of the project, if we will identify the adverse effects, there is no use. So, the anticipating adverse environmental impacts depends upon the project. If it is a pharma company, we can understand that what are the chemical effluents that can emerge from that pharmaceutical company. And at the adverse environmental impacts at the early stage of the project implementation also saves the time and is also beneficial. So, possible alternatives should be considered when adverse environmental impacts are anticipated. In considering alternatives, the primary consideration is whether applying the precautionary principle, the project is shown to environmentally acceptable. So, that means we have to understand that prior to propose any project activities, we have to anticipate the adverse impacts of that proposed project. Then we comes to the principle 4. So, the principle 4 shows that living process throughout the project cycle. That means not only once it is established, we cannot keep quiet. That means once we have started any of the project, we have to see the adverse impact assessment of any of the product manufacturer till the project comes to the market. So, the project entire cycle. So, in that the environmental impact assessment process should involve a course of dynamic actions throughout the project cycle to identify and predict the possible adverse environmental impacts from the proposed development to develop measures to avoid and then also prevent and reduce environmental problems and also to manage and control environmental impacts to within established limits or criteria. This is also most important. And principle 5 says that making environmental impact assessment recommendations enforceable. That means the environmental impact assessment recommendations should be sensible, practicable and also effective with information about the mitigation measures, that means 5 W's we have considered, that is what mitigation measures would be implemented, and the second W is by whom, when, where and to what requirements, and with comprehensible definition of the responsibility for implementing the recommended mitigation measures. So, the recommended measures that should be easy to enforce and can prevent environmental problems from occurring rather than relying on remedial measures after problems occur. We comes to the principle 6, that is a flexibility amidst robustness and transparency with public participation and with the ability to adapt to changes. So, in that the environmental impact assessment process should be transparent and also to take into account public participation, but should be flexible to adapt to changing circumstances without compromising the environmental requirements. Then principle 7 comes into the picture, that is a seeking practical environmental outcomes for the environment and community. So, one of the objectives of the environmental impact assessment process is to deliver and communicate practical environmental outcomes for the environment and the community. Then principle 8 comes into the picture, that is the avoidance of any late focus. That means early focus on major adverse environmental consequences could save a large amount of efforts or cost benefit, we can say that may otherwise arise from the expensive or time consuming remedial works at a later stage. If we will come to the principle 6, that is efficiency amidst effectiveness, that means an effective and efficient approach for any process it is required, and also in carrying out the environmental impact assessment studies step by step would enhance the productivity of the environmental impact assessment process. If we will consider principle 10, that is a transparent agreement among relevant parties, clear expectations of what need to be done and what the performance will be, and explicit resolution of any conflicts. It says that the agreements, expectations, performance, requirements and any conflict resolutions should be fully communicated among relevant parties in an open and frank manner to avoid misunderstanding and to enhance better management of environmental impact assessment by the follow-up of works. Then we will consider the operating principles. The operating principles of environmental impact assessment should be applied to the proposed activities before decision making phase and the entire life cycle of the proposed activities. To all projects which are likely to have potentially adverse effects, and also to consider progressive effects which compatible with the sustainable development concept like biophysical impacts and relevant socio-economic factors that includes health, culture, gender, lifestyle as well as the age. So, to facilitate the involvement of communities and associated public by the proposed activities of the industries. So, in accordance with the internationally agreed measures and activities, the operating principles like screening is most important. The first step of this process is the screening that determines whether a proposal should be subject to environmental impact assessment or not. And if it requires, then the level of environmental impact assessment required. So, if not, it provides an opportunity to explore and establish the possible alternatives for achieving proposed activities. And the next step of the operating principle is the scoping step. So, the scoping stage is identify the core issues which are likely to have adverse effects and scrutinize further also. It also defines the terms of reference like scope and the time limit. And the next stage is impact analysis. This analysis stage recognizes and also foresee the possible environmental and socio-economic impact of the proposed project and evaluate the significance. mitigation and impact management. This stage is most important. It advocates the activities to reduce and avoid the unfavorable environmental consequences of proposed developmental activities and also establish the measures to incorporate in the environmental impact assessment plan. The evaluation of the significance. And in this stage, environmental impact assessment determines the relative significance and eligibility of impacts that cannot be mitigated. So, environmental impact assessment, these are the some of the operation principles. And also we have to understand the environmental impact assessment statement or EIS, or we can say that in general it is a report. That means this is a crucial step of environmental impact assessment, in which after evaluation the unbiased facts on proposal impacts which are established mitigation measures and also inputs from the communities and the associated public that will be documented in the form of a report and present to the decision making authorities and also to display to the concerned public. After that, review of the environmental impact assessment is the step. The review stage that determines the sufficiency and efficacy of the report in order to meet the terms of reference which are necessary for decision making. Then comes to the decision making step, in which on the basis of all the previous steps of the environmental impact assessment, it finalizes whether to approve the proposal or reject, or there is a provision also that is needs further changes and also to enact the terms and conditions for its implementation. To follow up that step, after the proposed project is commissioned, this step ensures whether the project is working within the legal standards and also the implementing the mitigating measures or not, which are described in the environmental impact assessment report. It also monitors the optimization of that project proposal by conducting environmental audit and evaluates the procedure of environmental management. So that means it is not the case of the permission given to particular project until the evaluation of the project also it is necessary. So there are certain limitations for this environmental impact assessments. That means the limitations of environmental impact assessments, especially in the Indian scenario, are identified as a lack of expertise in the team which conducting the environmental impact assessment studies in the concerned fields for developing effective environmental impact assessment. And also the improper scoping step, the procedures, the methodologies, the techniques which are used for the environmental impact assessment. And also there are no checks on the competence and liability of environmental impact assessment consultancies. So the environmental impact assessment so far and the basic concepts of the introduction to the environmental impact assessment and the lack of exhaustive ecological and socio-economic indicators. So that means lack of reliable data sources, and there is no credibility for the primary data which is collected by the data collectors is definitely it is a doubtful. At the same time, there is a need among community also, that is a community based organizations, non-governmental organizations like NGOs, academicians and also environmental managers to review and interpret environmental impact assessment reports as they are technical in nature for general understanding and for informed decision making on issues and projects that will largely decide the fate of an area in particular or the country at large. So project screening, that is environmental impact assessment, is required or not, it tells about it. And scoping tells about the impacts and issues to be considered, that is the explanation of proposed project, explanation of the environmental baselines, explanation of the presentation of the findings of an environmental impact assessment statement, and anticipation of the impacts and the evaluation and assessment of importance of these impacts, and also the identification of measuring the mitigating measures and review of the environmental impact statements, decision making and post decision monitoring and auditing and prediction of mitigation measures. So all these things we have to consider. So dear learners, so far we have understand the principles as well as the practices which are comes under the Indian scenario. So far I think you must be benefited for this session, and the next session we will also cover some more aspects of the environmental impact assessment. Thank you.